Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Scrap the Cap webinar this morning. My name's Peter Kelly. I'm Director of the Poverty Alliance, and I'm really pleased that so many people are joining us today. We're really pleased to have launched this campaign, really delighted that so many people are joining us today. I'm just going to ask Wendy if you could switch your camera off just now, and we'll bring you back in later on. Thanks very much. I can see that some people are still joining us, and that will no doubt take a few minutes, but I'll just get started with some introductions because we've got a lot to get through over the next hour, so I don't want to take up too much time. But just to let everyone know that we are recording the webinar this morning. We'll post it later on the campaign site on the Poverty Alliance website later on. Just as by way of introduction, there are clearly many aspects of our current welfare system, our current social security system, that are in need of change, that are in need of reform, whether it's the value of benefits, whether it's the wait times for universal credit. It's a long list of areas where we need change. But I think there's something quite different about the benefits cap, something that makes it even perhaps more harmful than other elements. There's that aspect of conscious cruelty that I think the benefit cap represents. And it's that conscious cruelty, we think, that makes it an area that's perhaps subject to more change, or possible subject to more change, because of the way it so arbitrarily affects people's incomes and plunges people into poverty. And those are some of the issues and concerns that we want to discuss this morning. We've got a great selection of speakers for you this morning, who are going to take us through how the benefit cap impacts at the moment, and why it really needs to be changed. We're also really pleased that we have some representatives of political parties who will be joining us towards the second half of our webinar this morning, because what we really want to do with this webinar is look at how do we build the case at Westminster and across the UK for a campaign to see the end to the benefit cap. So that's all I'm going to say for the moment. I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Susie Marling, who is the campaigns officer with the Poverty Alliance, who's been leading on this campaign for the Poverty Alliance. I'm really delighted to hand over to you now, Susie, if you just want to switch your camera on.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks everyone for coming today. So I'm going to be giving an overview of the Scrap the Cap campaign that, as Peter said, we launched at the end of January, and I'm going to talk you through some of the findings from a survey we conducted about the benefit cap just recently, the results of which I think illustrate very clearly the reasons why we think the cap should be scrapped. But first, I'm going to quickly outline exactly what the benefit cap is. If you could just bear with me a wee second, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so the benefit cap was first introduced in 2013 as part of the austerity agenda, and its main aims were, in addition to reducing spending on social security, getting more people into work who the Conservative government believed should have been working, to encourage people to move to cheaper housing, and to introduce greater fairness into the social security system by creating greater parity between the average earned income from employment and the level of benefits offered. But as we'll see, these are very misleading justifications for the policy, and they just don't add up at all. So originally, the capped amount reflected the average earned income of a working household's take-home pay. But in 2017, all new and existing claimants affected by the cap received a new lower amount. So the current cap is £20,000 outside London, £23,000 inside London for a family, and for an individual outside London, it's £13,400. So those affected by the benefit cap receive on average £155 per week less in support than they would have if the cap wasn't in place. And as of May 2021, 190,000 households were affected by the cap. The cap's implemented through a reduction in either housing benefit or universal credit. And just to note as well that the benefit cap was introduced in part because it was actually a popular policy. The government had polled it as quite a popular policy, but I think it's really important that we note that the support for the policy wanes significantly when people actually understand the real impact and know exactly the ways in which it affects people. And that's partly what we're trying to do today, to explain the real experiences of the benefit cap. So the Scrap the Cap campaign calls on the government, the UK government, to scrap the unjust benefit cap. So to lift the limit placed on how much money a family can receive from benefits altogether. The reason for this is because the benefit cap removes the link between need and entitlement. So simply put, when a person or family has been assessed to be in need of an amount of money to get by in order to lead a decent and dignified life or to raise their children, when the amount they have been assessed to need exceeds the capped amount, so that's £20,000 for families outside London, their income is slashed. And any level of support that's below what a person's been assessed to need will necessarily be insufficient to lead a healthy, happy and dignified life. And further, the way the cap's designed means that those who require the highest level of support from the benefit system are the most likely to be affected, and this is simply unjust. So the campaign argues against the cap on the basis of some key arguments, which I'm going to very briefly talk through, but I won't mention some of the arguments because I know that some of our excellent speakers are going to focus on them, although inevitably there will be a little bit of overlap. So it's very much a non-exhaustive list, and I'll also put, when I'm finished, I'll put a link in the chat to our campaign pack, which gives more details about each of these points. So first of all, the benefit cap pushes families into deeper poverty and hardship. And with a cost of living crisis going on, those who are affected by the cap will feel the effects even more acutely than most. Secondly, the cap disproportionately affects Black and minority ethnic households, partly because they tend to live in larger families and therefore have higher costs. And also I think because there's a higher concentration of deaf communities in places like London, where housing costs are much higher. Third, the lowered amount, which I mentioned came into effect in 2017, breaks the link between the average income from benefits and the average take-home pay from employment. So the initial capped amount did reflect the average take-home pay from employment, but this is no longer the case, which therefore completely undermines the government's argument that the cap was in any way about fairness. Fourth, children's lives are being impacted by the cap. So 83% of capped households affected contain at least one child. And according to the Supreme Court, the benefit cap breaches the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child by depriving families of income that they need to stay afloat. 5, as well as breaching the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the benefit cap also flouts the right to an adequate level of social security. The UK government have a duty to provide a level of benefits which promotes the right to family life and allows for a reasonable standard of living, which the benefit cap does not allow for. 6, the majority of households affected by the cap actually don't need to look for work due to raising a young child or reasons to do with ill health. Again, undermining the government's argument that the cap is about getting households into work who they think should be working, but who are not. And this means that subjecting these families to the benefit cap knowingly and purposefully forces families into poverty who cannot turn to employment as a route out of poverty. And as I said, there are many more reasons why the benefit cap should be scrapped, and we'll hear about a few more of them soon. What I'm going to do now is I've talked about the benefit cap in a nutshell, and hopefully that's given you a broad overview. I'm going to talk about the results from a small-scale survey that we recently conducted between December 2021 and January 2022, just before we launched the campaign. So we had one survey for organisations in which a wide range of organisations who work with individuals affected by the cap responded, so 21 organisations responded. And we also conducted a survey for individuals themselves who are affected by the cap, and we got 26 responses from people who have been affected by the cap from a variety of different household circumstances. And again, I'll put a link in the chat to the briefing we produced on this survey if you're interested in getting some further information. So on the survey for organisations, all of the organisations who responded reported having worked with individuals, often regularly, who had been forced to use a food bank, borrow money from friends or family, or cut back on food expenses as a result of being affected by the benefit cap. Most organisations reported having worked with individuals who had been forced to reduce their gas or electricity usage, missed a payment for bills such as utilities, internet, phone, missed a payment for rent or council tax to pay for other essentials like food or heating, or moved to a cheaper accommodation, or faced eviction, and skipped social engagements because of the cost associated, so skipped seeing friends and family. And over half of the organisations who responded reported having worked with individuals affected by the cap who had been forced to take out a payday loan to cover expenses such as Christmas, birthday, car or appliance breakdown, or at the beginning of the school year. Taking out a payday loan to cover basic expenses, therefore pushing these families into the problem debt, or apply for a grant through the Scottish Welfare Fund. So here's a quote from one of the individuals who responded to the survey. "My kids see me worrying and it affects them. Their friends go to after school clubs and I can't afford to send them. I've had times where I've not been able to afford shoes for them and winter clothes." So in the survey for individuals, 25 of the 26 respondents who are affected by the benefit cap reported that their mental health has worsened because of the financial circumstances caused by the cap. 10 of those respondents reported that their physical health has worsened as well due to the effects of the benefit cap. And over half of the respondents already live in the cheapest type of accommodation, i.e. the rent from local authorities or housing associations. And this is a really important point because again, it undermines the government's incentives for introducing this policy. It was introduced in part, as I mentioned, to encourage people to move to cheaper housing, to therefore bring down the cost of housing benefits, that money that government's putting out paying for people's accommodation. But actually our survey shows, and there's also been much wider research done across the UK which shows that people are already by and large living in the cheapest accommodation, again undermining the government's justifications for the cruel policy. All respondents, individuals that is, at some point said that they've had to take measures to either increase their income or decrease their outgoings by means that would be considered detrimental to their overall well-being. So that's things I mentioned before, like going to a food bank, borrowing money for friends and family, using a payday loan, missing rent payments, etc. 62% of the respondents, individuals, said that in a normal month, they do not have enough money to cover basic household expenses such as rent, utilities and food. So that's the Scrap the Cap campaign in a nutshell and the findings from our survey. I hope that's given you an overview, and I think our excellent speakers are going to give a much richer understanding of the ways in which it affects individuals. And I just wanted to note, and I'll mention it again, that we are currently seeking signatures for an open letter to the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, asking him to use his spring statement to scrap the benefit cap. We'll put a link to my email in the chat as well, but there it's there. If your organisation wants to sign the letter, if you're an academic, etc., want to sign the letter, please do get in touch. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Susie. A really succinct, really helpful introduction as to why this campaign is so necessary and why we've taken the decision to launch this campaign earlier this year, which so far has, as Susie has said, has had great support. Just to remind you, use the chat function if you have questions for any of our speakers coming up, and we'll get to those when we get the bit of Q&A just after 10:30. I want to move on quickly now to our next speaker, who is Ellie Dixon. Ellie is Policy and Parliamentary Manager at Engender. Engender is a feminist advocacy and policy organisation based in Scotland, and Ellie's going to give us an overview of how the cap disproportionately impacts on women. Ellie, good to see you, and over to you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to you and your colleagues at the Poverty Alliance for inviting Engender to participate in this event. Engender is really proud to support the Scrap the Cap campaign. The benefit cap has a disproportionate and egregious effect for women in the UK. It undermines their safety, well-being, access to opportunities, and those of their children. As women are more reliant on social security than men for all or part of their income, women are also overrepresented amongst those who have been impacted by the benefit cap. And while I'm here specifically to talk about the benefit cap, I think it's worth zooming out for a moment to think about how the UK welfare system and its design, particularly universal credit, operates. Welfare reforms that were introduced from 2010 onwards were the product of a trend towards what we call a familyization of social security, that being data and entitlement and payment being concentrated towards a household unit rather than individuals, breaking that link, as Susie was talking about, between individual need and receipt of social security in the UK. Whilst that is a UK phenomenon, that trend has been seen further afield around the world. And another feature is that explicitly some proponents of the system in the UK stated that reform should be linked to the social policy of reducing family breakdown. So in practice, this of course means centralising control over finances and reducing individual entitlement to make it more complicated to separate when you're in a couple. But the complexities of this tend to fall on women's shoulders, leaving them at risk of destitution, domestic abuse, ongoing debt, and other problems. Universal credit has been described by third sector leaders as discrimination by design, and the UN Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty has suggested that if you got a group of misogynists together in a room and said, how can we make a system that works for men but not for women, they wouldn't have come up with many other ideas than what's in place. So what are the elements of the system that are operating at fault? Well, firstly, the single household payment entrenches control over family income with one partner and cements an outdated breadwinner caregiver model. And because women continue to do the majority of care for children and older and disabled people, and because of women's income inequality, they are often designated second earners within households. This is coupled with a 5-week wait for the first payment, which complicates matters further on relationship breakdown, leaving women at risk of debt or destitution in order to feed their families. And the 2-child limit undermines reproductive autonomy, punishing women with poverty for having a third child, and has been shown to be forcing women to end much wanted pregnancies. While the abhorrent rape clause requires women to disclose a traumatic experience at a time and place not of their choosing, just to avoid total destitution. And this picture, I think, serves as a useful background for talking about the impacts of the benefit cap as one aspect of this system. Even within a system that is functioning, in a way that is inherently discriminatory towards women, the benefit cap limits women and their children's income to £384.62 a week. 94% of capped households have children, 72% are lone parents, nearly 80% have a child under the age of 5, and half have a child under the age of 3. The vast majority of these will be women, and as we'll hear, I suspect in much greater detail from Marion, the group most affected by the benefit cap are single parents. Nearly 3/4 of the total people impacted by the benefit cap are lone parent families. Women with young children are particularly vulnerable to the cap because of insufficient affordable childcare that might enable them to earn income from paid work on equal terms as men. Women with very young children or babies are given a more limited work conditionality under universal credit, but are still subject to the benefit cap. The benefit cap also claims to incentivize people to move into work. Women continue to face significant and persistent barriers to the labour market even when they don't have children, and are overrepresented in insecure and part-time work, which undermines their lifetime earnings and labour market security. All of these, of course, have been exacerbated by COVID, as the sectors where women work in greater numbers than men have been disproportionately affected by COVID and related public health restrictions. So the justification that the benefit cap is connected to work or about incentivizing entry into work re-entrenches within us a really narrow view of what work actually means, focused solely on labour market participation and ignoring the vast quantity of unpaid work that continues to be carried out by women in terms of care for older adults and disabled people, childcare, domestic work, and community volunteering. All of that is not included within our framing of work, yet saves billions of pounds to the UK economy. The benefit cap further impacts women who are experiencing or have experienced domestic abuse, and it leaves women forced to manage inadequate resources or faced with needing to look for work while managing caring responsibilities, legal matters, and trauma at a point in which they are at greatest physical unsafety. This is exacerbated where women are then required to move out of their home in order to keep their family safe, but may in fact be living away from their traditional support networks or informal childcare. Women staying in refuge are exempt from the benefit cap. However, it is applied to women who then move into other temporary or permanent accommodation, and it can leave people having to decide between paying the rent and buying food. During the debates in the UK's Domestic Abuse Act, the House of Lords debated adding amendments that would exempt survivors of domestic abuse from having to repay advances received to manage the 5-week wait of universal credit and a 12-month lifting of the benefit cap. And while these amendments weren't successful, they would have represented a limited improvement to a system that is inherently putting women at risk of financial destitution when they're trying to ensure their physical, mental, or other form of personal safety. And so Engender's assessment is that the structural flaws within the UK social security system, and particularly within universal credit, are so great that they cannot be fully addressed by mitigation programmes. That being said, we have strongly urged the Scottish Government to do all it can do to reduce the compounding impact of welfare reform on women's poverty. And options such as the Scottish Child Payment have demonstrated that there are opportunities within the devolved powers to meet urgent needs. So we are currently working with Child Poverty Action Group and Scottish Women's Aid to look at options for support for women who are leaving an abuser through targeted funds capable of short-term recurring payments to manage that 5-week wait and the establishment of a new home. Universal credit, the two-child limit and the benefit cap are all collectively undermining women's access to resources, to safety, and entrenching poverty. And simply scrapping one policy won't be enough. There are elements within all three we need to see reversed, but scrapping the cap would be a first step to delivering a social security system that works for women in the UK. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ellie. I think really important to put the efforts to scrap the benefit cap in the wider context of our social security system. I think that issue of discrimination by design is one that we should all be very conscious of in any work that we do around calling for change in social security at the UK level or at Scottish level in our case. I'm going to again move on quite quickly to Marion Davis. Marion is the Director of Policy, Communications and Strategy at One Parent Families Scotland, an organisation that's got a very long history of working directly with lone parents and particularly with women, and she's going to talk to us about some of the experience of single parent families and the benefit cap. So over to you now, Marion.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks very much to the Poverty Alliance for the invitation today, and really congratulations, I think, for focusing on this really detrimental policy. I have a few slides, so I'm going to attempt to share the screen with you. There we go. Screen. Trying to find slideshow. Can people see that?
Yep, you're fine, Marion.
Do you know how I get onto slideshow at all? Oh, here we go. What's this? Oh yes, yeah. As Peter said, I'm Marion from One Parent Families Scotland, and just going to do a bit of an input into single parents and the benefit cap. As Ellie mentioned, the one group in society that's really negatively affected by the cap, and in fact the two-child policy, are single parents. So what I'm going to do is just say a bit about One Parent Families Scotland, and a pen picture of single parents in Scotland, and then a bit about single parents and child poverty and the impact of the cap, and just a couple of case studies of parents who've been in touch with us for advice about the cap. So One Parent Family Scotland, we provide services for families across Scotland and specifically in 5 local authorities. We've got a Scottish-wide information and advice and support service, and we campaign with parents to change the systems, the policies and the attitudes that cause poverty. And so therefore we're very pleased to be part of the Scrap the Cap campaign. Over the past year, we worked with 17,500 parents, children and young people, and we provide benefits advice, money advice, crisis grants to over 6,000 families, and that brought gains of 3.2 million, which was a lot higher than we have done in previous years. Just a pen picture of single parents in Scotland, 144,000, a quarter of all families with dependent children. So quite a large group in Scottish society. The average age of a single parent is mid-30s. There's a lot of myths around that single parents are teenagers. Of course, some are teenagers, but most are women, mothers in their 30s. And another myth is that single parents don't work, but in fact, the latest stats show, well, it's pre-pandemic, 68% of single parents are in paid work. Child poverty is the backdrop of the child poverty is the backdrop of the benefit cap. 4 in 10 children in poverty in Scotland live in a single parent family. So a huge group of the children in poverty live with one parent. 39% of children in single parent families live in poverty. And in terms of Scottish Government's delivery plan, child poverty delivery plan, when you look at the target groups, 66% of single parents are in more than one of those 5 groups. So basically, single parents and their children are a key group that we really want to have policies where we intervene and help to reduce child poverty. And the benefit cap does the opposite of that. Some of these figures have been covered. Over 6,000 households affected by the cap. The average 208 a month, and 97% of benefit capped households have children, and 68% are single parent families. And as Ellie said, it's single parents with babies and toddlers make up 1/3 of the single parents affected by the cap, and that is a big challenge for these parents for all the reasons that we know around childcare and flexible work. This is just it's a diagram which shows like the kind of in a descriptive way the proportion of households affected by the cap, and you'll see that single parents with dependents are such a huge percentage, and in fact that percentage has gone up over the last year. Single parents benefit capped have gone up by kind of a substantial amount. So just moving on. Just looking at the options for these parents, and the government want to see this as a policy as to support or to encourage people into work. For single parents, there's a lack of suitable, flexible, family-friendly jobs. There's a shortage of suitable childcare, and as I've mentioned earlier, the impact being on younger children, there's a shortage of childcare, particularly for under 2s. And if the option is to move house because rent's too high and not covered by housing benefit anymore, it's actually really hard to find new housing and cheaper housing. So the impact is huge on those parents and children that are affected. It's severe. Families going without basic necessities. There's an incredible effect on physical, mental health of parents and children. It's immense. I just wanted to tell you about a single mum from Glasgow that called our advice line, just before Christmas. She had been working. She's on universal credit, been moved on, and has lost. She lost her job. She's got a benefit cap of £526. Our partner left her in a financial mess. She's got an electricity bill of over £700 was due, and they were going to cut her off. She had rent arrears, and she's now having to leave the family home because yeah, she's getting chucked out. It's got so much for her that she tried to end her life twice. She couldn't see a way out. She's now on medication. As she describes it, me and my kids have been through hell with no support from anyone. Scottish Welfare Fund has helped, normally apply 3 times, and food banks have helped, but again, only so many times. And the reason she phoned is Christmas. I've no money to buy even one gift for each of my children. No family, don't get gifts from anyone else, and can't afford Christmas dinner. So she's been applying for every job out there, but it's tough times, and she just wishes to have a proper Christmas for her kids. So she's been in touch with us to see how, in any way that we could help. We did help her with the grant. Marie again from Dundee. Sometimes it's a case of, and people will have heard this already, do I feed the kids or pay the bills? And she chooses to feed her kids, of course she do. And it's got her more and more into debt. And her housing benefits reduced because of the benefit cap, and leaves her with a large shortfall. She's pointing out the issue is around childcare. She can't find the money up front to get a job. Schools are only open sort of during term time, and how does she pay for the kind of holiday cover? She feels trapped. And I think that is the same for most on the benefit cap. They feel trapped. It's not an enabler. So just to finalise, scrapping the cap, why does One Parent Families Scotland support this campaign? Because the benefit cap means children's basic needs are not being met, and they're not getting any chance along with other children. The pandemics made things a lot worse and increased hardship and inequality, and we really think action is needed to tackle that. Child poverty limits children's lives and well-being now and in the future, and many single parents want to get a job, but work really just doesn't pay, and so universal credit is failing parents and children instead of pulling them out of poverty. So OPFS is 100%, and that's just my details behind the campaign. And yeah, we'll be signing the letter to the Chancellor, and anything else that we can do, we'll be supporting the Poverty Alliance to achieve the end of the benefit cap. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mary. And again, some really important information there, and important quotes, I think, from people who are who've been impacted by the benefit cap, really reinforces the real urgent need is for change and for reform. I would remind you, just we've got a couple of questions coming into the chat just now. I would ask you if you have got questions for any of our speakers. We're going to have a wee bit of time just after our next speaker for them all to maybe respond to some of those questions. So I'm going to turn over now to Dr. Aaron Reeves. Aaron is Associate Professor at University of Oxford in Department of Social Policy and Intervention, and he's also the co-lead on the Larger Families Project. Aaron is going to tell you all about the Larger Families Project, so I won't do that, but a project specifically focused around the impact of the benefit cap and the 2-child limit. So Aaron, over to you. Really delighted to have you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak about this. And so exactly, I mean, what I'm going to try and do now is provide just a brief overview of some of the emerging findings that are coming out of the research project. As you said, the Larger Families Project, benefit changes on larger families, but we're really focused on the 2-child limit and the benefit cap. This is a collaboration between researchers at Oxford, where I'm based, but also York and the LSE. And we're working really closely with Child Poverty Action Group, who've been a fantastic partner on this and have been doing really important work in this space too. And of course, I really want to acknowledge the Nuffield Foundation, who are funding this work, and I think have really supported us in trying to drive forward the research in this area. So I very simply have a couple of key messages that I want to try and share. And the first of these is that the benefit cap comes into an environment in which child poverty has been rising in the UK since around 2013, but it's been rising most acutely among larger families, as this graph shows. So what you can see here is trends in poverty rates among children in households of different sizes before and after housing costs. And the green line here is where almost all of the action is. That decline through the mid 2000s up to the point in which the 2010 period where we start to see this reverse and turn around and rising again. So the benefit cap is kind of compounding this general trend of exposing children to poverty over this period. The second thing that I want to bring out is the way in which the benefit cap is impacting labour markets. So this graph comes from data analysis that we've conducted as part of this project, which tries to look at what happened to labour market activity among those who were potentially at risk of being capped and those that weren't, before and after the cap was lowered in late 2016. So on the left-hand side here is the sort of overall effect on households in terms of their employment. And what you can see is that there was maybe a slight increase in the employment rate among those households that were at risk of being capped, but this isn't kind of significant at traditional levels in the kinds of statistical analysis that we would usually conduct. But really what's happening is that that overall employment effect is actually masking two other trends. So yes, there does seem to be a reduction in the amount of unemployment, but part of that reduction in unemployment is actually people moving into economic inactivity. These are people that are moving away from the labour market. And that is radically different from what's happening in the population more broadly. So the benefit cap may be, as government has argued, getting some people back into work, but it's also pushing an equally large group away from the labour market. Indeed, it's undermining the government's aims of trying to incentivise these people back into work. So why is it doing this? Well, part of the reason is that the benefit cap has harmed mental health. And we've heard a great deal about this already today. And this graph is also part of the analysis that we're doing in this project. And what it really shows is that for capped individuals, the trend in mental health was relatively flat until the cap was lowered at the end of 2016. From that point on, we start to see this gradual and steady rise in the risk of experiencing mental ill health over this period, and actually has risen by almost 50% among that group from an already very high level. And there is a direct correlation between experiencing mental ill health and moving into economic inactivity, moving away from the labour market. And this is really highlighted by one of the people that we've been speaking to as part of this project. This is Jessica, a single mother of four, who's been affected by the benefit cap, and really resonates, I think, with both what Ellie and Marion have already said. You know, not only does the health effects of the cap make it difficult for Jessica to find work, but actually there are a variety of other constraints that put pressure on these families that just make it difficult for them to get access to the labour market in the way that many of them would want to, but find it difficult to at this point in their lives because of their caring responsibilities. One of the other things that's come out of the work that we've been conducting, we've been trying to find other countries around the world that have been using policies like this. And at the moment, as far as we can tell, and we've looked across 40 to 50 high-income countries, the UK is an outlier. The only other country that seems to have something a little bit like what the UK has is Denmark. That is actually currently being debated and may actually get rescinded. But even the UK's version of this policy is much more acute than that experienced in Denmark. And so we are internationally an unusual country in the way that we've pursued this policy. And then I think one of the responses to this is, well, has it been effective at actually trying to save money for government? Well, as many of you will know, the Work and Pensions Committee reported a few years ago that it was saving around £190 million per year. But is that a big number? Well, actually, in terms of the overall aim in terms of welfare savings from a variety of the policies that have been implemented from 2010 forward, this is a minuscule amount. And indeed, even this number, 190 million, does not even include any of the costs that are borne as a result of this policy. It doesn't include things like discretionary housing payments, which were used and still are being used to offset the effects of the benefit cap in some instances. It doesn't include the administration costs of actually running the policy. And more importantly, it doesn't account for the costs in other parts of the social security system and welfare state more broadly as a result of the harms created by this policy, including those health effects that I've talked about and others have mentioned too. But I suppose we really know that at root, this policy wasn't necessarily about saving money. As Rupert Harrison, who was at the time a special advisor to George Osborne, said to Lloyd Freud, who was also one of the architects of many of the austerity policies that were implemented since 2010, I know it doesn't make much sense in the way of savings, but we've never had such a popular policy. The benefit cap is doing real harm to households and families that are exposed to it. And as Susie said at the beginning, it breaks that link between need and entitlement. And it isn't necessarily even delivering on the promise of getting people back into work, nor saving the government money. I'll end there and look forward to discussing this more with you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aaron. Again, really powerful stuff there, really powerful evidence on the way that the benefit cap is actually operating. I'm going to invite all of our speakers so far, so Aaron, Ellie, Marion and Susie, to come back onto the screen. And we're running a little bit over time, almost inevitably running a little bit over time, but I just wanted to pose a couple of questions that are coming out from the chat. And again, if people have got any other questions while everyone's on screen, then please fire them in. But we've had a question, I guess it speaks more to how do we mitigate the impacts of the benefit cap rather than the need to scrap it. I think we've all been fairly clear on the egregious nature, as you said, Ellie, of the benefit cap. But we've had questions about, particularly at local authority level, is there more that could be done locally or by local authorities to try and mitigate, to try and reduce that impact of the benefit cap? Don't know if anyone wants to come in on that one. Marion.
Sorry.
Marion, you had your microphone off.
Yep.
On first, so on you go.
Yeah, that's fine. I think our experience has been that we've tried to support parents as much as we can to get DHPs to sort of help to bridge the gap between the rent and housing benefit, which has been reduced by the benefit cap. Yeah, in some cases that's been successful, but the DHP kind of model, it's not a sort of long-term solution. And some local authorities have got different policies on it as well, as far as I'm aware. You know, so you can have a DHP, you know, but it can only last for so long. Gives the family some breathing space to find alternative accommodation. But I think a more permanent solution is required. And I think probably, I know this is a Westminster policy, but I think there are things probably Scottish Government could do with their powers to support, you know, kind of, I think, families, because it clearly is, it's families with children, mainly single parents with children, a lot of them with young children, and they fall into the target groups of the Scottish Government's Child Poverty Delivery Plan. So I think there's more discussion to be had around that, if at all possible. So we do want to avoid parents with young children moving away from the school the kids are at, maybe where family is because they've been capped and they can't afford the rent, move into smaller accommodation where the kids are all sharing one room, and it's just not beneficial for mental health and well-being.
Thanks, Marion. I think we also need to be conscious right across the UK, local authorities have been under incredible financial pressure now for more than 10 years, and for them to take on the consequences of a UK central government decision seems unfair, to say the least. I don't know if Ellie or Aaron, you wanted to come in on that question of local authorities. Ellie?
I did, but I think I do with some trepidation, because I'm always really nervous around this idea that we can mitigate. And as Marion said, the need for some breathing space is definitely something we can do, but we do need a long-term solution. And that was when I was talking about, just at the end of my remarks, about working on this idea of a leaving fund for women who are leaving an abusive partner, which we know is the most dangerous time for women and for their children. But again, we're working within quite narrow parameters of what can we do in the short term to give those women breathing space to make a decision safely and avoid that immediate destitution. So I sort of want to push back on the idea that we can mitigate and we should mitigate, because the whole system, as I pointed out, is working together in a way that is designed to be discriminatory. That being said, I think another thing that we could do away from the benefit system, and we should be doing this anyway, is investing in childcare, investing in affordable, fully flexible, wraparound, free at the point of use childcare for all people, all parents, not just those affected by the benefit cap. But one of the big issues that single parents face and women face is not being able to get into work because of their childcare responsibilities. That need to pay your childcare costs up front and then claim them back if you're using the childcare element of universal credit is a big barrier as well. And childcare in the UK is some of the most expensive in the world. And so we could and we should be expanding childcare, seeing it as infrastructure. And I think it would save us money in the long term by enabling women to stay in work if that's what they want to do, if stay in paid work if that's what they want to do. So I think it would be somewhere else we could direct our attention that would have demonstrable benefits, not just for this group, but for everybody.
Thanks, Ellie. We've had one other question, and I'll take this one, and then we'll go to our final questions to politicians. So we've had a question around whether, in terms of maybe an interim step for the Scrap the Cap campaign, one of the things that we could look at is whether we could successfully raise the level of the benefit cap. What's your thoughts on that as a perhaps a step towards scrapping?
Maybe I'll just jump in quickly on this. My sense is that isn't necessarily the right strategy, and the reason that it's not, although I think it can be, it would certainly do some of that work of temporarily alleviating some of the burden for some families. But the reason that it's not is this is a classic example of what's called policy drift, where the kind of changing circumstances that people are exposed to are not create conditions that mean that they're affected by policies which are not uprated with those changing conditions, right? Like, so it forces the community that want to address this policy to be constantly fighting the battle about getting the cap raised, which detracts energy from other issues, but also gives, you know, as wages go up, as prices go up, the cap is going to kind of have that drag effect, which eventually is going to push those families back into being affected by it. And so the challenge, I think, for us is not necessary to get caught into that battle of trying to get it lifted and raised, because I think over the long run, that isn't going to deliver, and is actually going to be a battle that is actually going to detract attention from other issues which are also really important. So I think I can see an argument for it, but it wouldn't be the thing that I think is going to really help in the long run for me.
Thanks,
Aaron. Susie.
Yeah, I'll just come in very quickly. Completely agree with Aaron. I think that sums it up really nicely. I just wanted to note as well that actually this week, was it Wednesday, I think, David Linden sponsored an adjournment debate in the House of Commons, raising the issue of the Scrap the Cap campaign and arguing against it. And we heard from the Minister in response, and what we heard was that there's zero movement and where the Conservative government are in terms of support for the policy and keeping the policy, and they trotted out all the same justifications that they used way back in 2013. So we've seen no movement, and I imagine that's in large part, if not wholly, because it's a popular policy. So I think that one of the reasons why we don't kind of split the policy up into these kind of nitty gritty small kind of changes is because to get the cap lifted for so long as we have a Conservative government, the work needs to be done in actually changing the public opinions around the cap and explaining to people exactly why the cap in itself, the existence of splitting that link between need and entitlement and the poverty that causes is so problematic and so harmful, because as I said at the beginning, support does wane when people understand exactly the impacts that it's having on individuals and the hardship that it causes. So I think our strategy, just strategically in terms of the campaign, what we really have to be doing is working on building public support for the campaign and changing public opinions. And I think we do that just by keeping a clear-cut message that the scrap has to go because it's incredibly harmful.
Thanks very much, Susie. I think Susie's comments there are a really perfect segue into our next panel with our politicians, to really think about, well, what do we do next? How do we build a coalition around this? So thanks again to all of our speakers so far. I'd like to invite now Wendy Chamberlain and Paul Sweeney to join us. And thanks for your patience and being with us already all through the discussion this morning. Hopefully Paul can join us now as well. If you just want to switch on your camera, Paul, and we'll get started. So,
sorry, let me switch my.
Oh, right. Okay, let me do that for you. I think you should be able to do it now.
There we are.
It's me being too dictatorial in my Zoom management there. Sorry about that, Paul. So just by way of introduction for our audience, Wendy is MP for North East Fife, Liberal Democrat, spokesperson for Scotland, Wales and for working pensions. And Paul Sweeney is an MSP for the Glasgow region. He's in the Scottish Parliament and Shadow Minister for Employment and Public Finance. And Paul was also previously an MP down in Westminster as well. And I guess it's on us now to think about, well, what we've heard a lot of the evidence this morning, both from campaigners, from the academic evidence about the impact of the benefit cap. But what we wanted to do this morning is have a conversation with you both about, well, what do we do politically about this? How do we take forward some of the asks in the Scrap the Cap campaign? And I maybe just start with a question for both of you about how you're seeing the impact of the benefit cap come through in your constituency work. You know, is this something that's coming through clearly and distinctly? Is it part of the wider issues that come through an MP's or MSP's constituency office in relation to social security matters? And I'll maybe start with you, Paul, because you have your mic on already.
Yeah, well, thanks, Peter. It's been a really interesting discussion so far, very thought-provoking. I've certainly learned some things that are important to take forward. Yeah, I think the key thing for me is observing what's going on since the universal credit cap uplift was suspended. For example, I've seen a significant uplift. You know, it's combined with a general cost of living crisis with inflationary effects. So just destitution being a major issue, particularly for families with dependent children. Housing crisis, people in rent arrears facing real problems with their housing associations, you know, general pressure on finances being a big issue. Working very closely with the Citizens Advice Bureau in particular to try and maximise claims. A lot of people are under-claiming what they're entitled to, so we're trying to go through the myriad of complex interdependencies to make sure they're qualifying for the benefits. You know, the bureaucracy can often militate against people's efficient allocation, so making sure we're sort of doing everything we can there. But yeah, definitely a noticeable increase. But I think the wider issue is actually, you know, I was just doing a sort of personal calculation based on some of the raw data out there, and for, you know, it was quite alarming figures for Glasgow alone. So I've calculated it's 83,026 households losing £1,040 a year each. So that's an £86.3 million extraction of income from the city's economy. You know, that's not insignificant from an actual economic perspective. And as we know, in Glasgow, 31% of people on universal credit already in work. 23% have no work requirement due to disability or caring responsibility, and 45% are searching, planning, or preparing for it. It's actually a minority of people who are unemployed. So the whole narrative that the Conservative Party have constructed around it being about fecklessness, encouraging job, you know, people entering into the workplace is just a misnomer. It's actually patching up a structurally failing employment system that's grossly underpaying people. And as we also know, the marginal propensity consumers economists would call it, that every penny going into these households is going back out in consumption. So actually you're sucking demand out of the economy. So I'm trying to increasingly move towards this idea that it needs to be about the economic common sense of actually putting households in these positions into a financial situation where they're able to actually help pump prime the economy in a recovery phase. You know, we need to frame it like that rather than being this kind of narrative around dependency, which I think has just been so obnoxious for so long.
Thanks, Paul. Again, I think really important points there as well. Maybe ones that we haven't touched on so far in our discussion about the wider economic impacts of any cut to social security. But I think this one, given its sort of targeted nature on larger families, is particularly harmful. But Wendy, how has this started to come through in your own constituency work? How do you see it manifest itself?
Very much, Peter, and again, thank you for inviting me along this morning, and thanks for the inputs and all of you who are in attendance as well. It's clearly something that we all care about. Now, North East Fife has got a reputation of being quite a well-off constituency, and there's absolutely true that there are high earners within the constituency, but actually what we do see is we have a number of economies in North East Fife which are precarious. Tourism, agriculture, they rely on a casual workforce who, you know, potentially don't have regular jobs or regular employment. I think the other aspect which would maybe not picked up on, other than in relation to the universal credit £20, is the impact of COVID. And what we see is an increased number of people who have come into contact with the welfare system who have never had to do so before and found out that it is not the safety net that they were expecting. But I do think we've ended up in this situation where there's such complexity within the benefit system where people are actually scared to look at taking on employment because it potentially has an impact, and always negatively, on the benefits that they might have. And when you are in a position where you are counting the pennies, frankly, to be able to ensure that you can heat your home or feed your children or those other things, that people are confused, and therefore it is, you know, at least there's a degree of certainty around where they are. Paul rightly pointed out the cost of living crisis that we are seeing. The additional aspect for rural constituencies, communities, is for people potentially having to travel for work and costs associated with that as well. But it's just, you know, as I say, I think the other bits I was sort of thinking about was, you know, the DWP under the current government is always focused on getting people into work. What it fails to do is to accept that there are people who cannot work for very good reasons. And if we look at the benefit cap and the fact that it is larger families who are impacted on it, actually to better support those families at the time when children are younger and need care, so childcare would be an aspect of that, they then would help better prepare those parents for the time when they can come into work, rather than penalising them at the time. The other bit is just that, you know, and I thought it was really interesting what Aaron was saying around mental health issues. There's absolutely no doubt, again, post-pandemic, that we are seeing an increase in those with mental health, and again, quite complex issues. I've been doing some work on long COVID. I had an adjournment debate on that last week, and there is a real failure of the benefit system to recognise those people who have fluctuating illness, whether that be mental health or conditions such as ME or long COVID, which we clearly don't understand about. People's situations are dynamic, they change all the time, and we have a system that clearly just doesn't reflect that.
Thanks very much, Wendy. And just to carry on that theme around the complexity of our social security system, that is something that you've both raised, and it's been raised by someone in the comments as well. The whole, or at least the rationale, the justification for part of the, we're still in this long tail of welfare reform from 2013, but part of the rationale for that was simplification and to make the system easier to navigate, and for those transitions in and out of work to be easier, and that seems to have failed entirely. But it would appear from what you've both said is that the UK government seems to take no cognizance of that at all, and I do wonder, where does that leave us in terms of shifting this current government in respect to some of its welfare change priorities? And possibly two questions here for you. The other is around public attitudes. We've heard several of our speakers already this morning talk about the support that the government at the time identified for the welfare, for the benefit cap. What do we do to try and unpick that from your experiences as politicians, as campaigners? What can we do to start undermining that narrative that was so prevalent at the time the cap was introduced, that this is about making the system fairer, about ensuring that everyone was on the same level playing field, which is clearly not the case. But how do we unpick that?
Thanks, Peter. I'll come in first, if I may. I think that part of it is because people probably haven't appreciated, those who aren't in contact with the benefits system, that there is now a lower payment. It does feel that this 20,000 and 23,000 is just an arbitrary figure that's been plucked out of the air to be simplified, and isn't attached to inflation, isn't attached to the cost of living that we're talking about. It's a flat figure. Whereas previously, because I was having a look at the sort of report a year on from the benefit cap being introduced, is obviously how it was positioned in the first instance was that it was an average of the working take-home pay. And I suppose when you position that from a perspective of, is it right that people in receipt of benefits are taking home more money than those who are working? Well, you can see that there's that work incentive, but clearly, as been ably demonstrated by your contributors today, that is not the effect of the cap. That is not what it is doing. I think the other aspect I picked up from that report is there was 51,000 households in 2014 impacted by the benefit cap. The last stats I saw from August 2021 were 180,000. This is affecting a lot more people. There's a chance that people looking at it will know somebody who's impacted by the cap. So I wonder if it's better communication with the public in relation to that. And I know, a number of the agencies and people on here will do work in that regard. But I also think as a result of that, there was, from a political perspective, all MPs, regardless of their political stripes, will get casework in relation to DWP, and so therefore be having an idea of what's happening. I've just taken on co-chairship of the all-party parliamentary group for food banks, ending the need for food banks in Westminster, and we are just commencing our first proper inquiry, looking at sort of different approaches to ending the need for food banks, so cash-based approaches, etc. And actually, what has been positive about that is we have a Conservative MP who is part of the group and part of the inquiry, because we need to take forward these things on a cross-party basis, particularly if we want to make inroads with this current government. So from that perspective, those are two of the things that I would continue to work away at. But I think reality is COVID means that more people have come into contact with the benefit system, have potentially a better awareness of its complexities, and therefore hopefully more empathy for those who are in contact with it on a longer term basis.
Thanks, Wendy. And I guess the same questions to you, Paul. That important issue that Wendy raised there about the impact of COVID, particularly in respect to more people engaging with the social security system across the UK, is that perhaps a bit of an opportunity for us to have a different kind of discussion about social security? And what are your views, given your experience down at Westminster, what are your views on how do we build that cross-party coalition at Westminster? Are there opportunities to do that? Wendy's mentioned the cross-party groups, and I should say at this point as well that David Linden, who had the debate the other day, wasn't able to make it today, so did send his apologies. So I just wanted to be clear on that. But Paul, over to you.
Yeah, well, this time last year I was relying on universal credit because I was unemployed. I was down to my last £20 when I got elected, so it was pretty much by the skin of my teeth, to be honest with you. Otherwise, I'd have probably lost my flat. So the stakes were pretty high for me this time last year, relying on that. And I wasn't alone. People assume if you're in a relatively high-paid job, you'd be still financially secure if you lost it. Actually, most people are maybe 2 months salary away from severe hardship. So people don't run with massive savings, especially young people. So just how vulnerable and fragile society actually is, and how reliant so many people are on the social security system. Just how many people are actually still in employment who are reliant on it as well, because our economy is structurally inclined to pay low wages. And I think that's a big issue we need to tackle. The Conservatives have been very effective at constructing a narrative. I remember George Osborne talking about people going out to work and seeing next door neighbour's house with the curtains drawn. They were lazy, they were feckless, it wasn't fair, and all this, trying to appeal to that basest instinct of sort of, of frustration, of rage, and people's sense of unfairness. And it was a perverse activity, because these are multimillionaires. It was a perverse exercise in deceit. But I think the most powerful weapon we have in our armory is telling these stories about the common sense necessity of addressing this problem, that everyone has a common vulnerability here, but also a common opportunity, making sure our communities are resilient. And I think that's the most important thing we can tell that story about. I mentioned that those statistics about Glasgow's economic effect, the community suffers. We have to make those points that if our neighbours are drowning in financial insecurity, if they're suffering that kind of depressive effect on not just their income, but all the negative health effects that will have, and everything else, the chaos introduced into their lives, that's a net loss to our community. The denial of opportunity, if you take the individual citizen as the unit of potential for our country as a whole, it's destroying and causing so much needless vandalism to people's lives. That's the tragedy of it for me. And what struck me was when I was applying for universal credit, I think it was around about May 2020. Yeah, it would have been about May. That was kind of when I started to get, struggle a bit. I was struck by how simple it was, because the government had deliberately re-engineered the system to make it extremely easy to access. And that was just a matter of sticking some new code into the system. Relatively speaking, it was like doing your car tax or something like that. It was the UK gov.uk website, the similar interface that you would use for a number of other different things. I didn't actually find it that difficult. Maybe it's easy for me to say as a kind of millennial IT literate person, but I personally found it relatively straightforward. The thing it was difficult for me was waiting 4 weeks to find out how much I would get, and then the 5th week before I would get the first payment. So that cash flow effect and the uncertainty of what I was actually going to get once they factored in savings, etc. That was the difficulty I encountered with the initial phase. And then engaging with the work coach at the job centre in Glasgow remotely. It was via telephone conversations. Incredibly nice person, conversational. She was a bit bewildered that she was talking to a former MP, but we had a friendly conversation, very supportive, understanding of what my objectives were, what my longer term aspirations were, patient with me. But also we had, a broader conversation about the sort of clients she was dealing with. She was dealing with airline pilots. She was dealing with, self-employed people, artists, people who, had previously fairly stable and what would be considered in society fairly decent jobs, suddenly floundering because of the way the economy had been so suddenly disrupted. So they had a much more relaxed and much more patient approach to things. And I'm like, well, why can't that be the norm? Why shouldn't the social security system be structured in a way in which it's customer friendly, it's treating people with respect, it's actually focused on maximizing what you're entitled to? We had a lot of conversations about where I should be applying for new style job seekers allowance. Actually, that was in itself a bit of a nightmare, because I was getting 15 different letters telling me 15 different things about what I was entitled to within the space of a month. Trying to access Scottish Welfare Fund, trying to apply for council tax reductions. All of these things are also disconnected. You have to sit with a wee checklist, like an airline pilot starting up the plane, and go through everything you need to apply for. Seriously, with the sort of level of IT integration we have now, with the digital economy, with the Internet of Things, with AI, we could easily integrate all this stuff so that if you apply for some part of the system, it will trigger your council tax rebate. It will trigger potential Scottish Welfare Fund payments. That's the thing that really irritates me about how things are going just now, because I think the Scottish social security system has been set up in a sort of isolated silo, where it's not really integrating very well at all with other parts of the social security system. And that's a real source of frustration for me, because I think ultimately the 2016 Act allowed any sort of benefit to be uplifted or enhanced, but we aren't realising the full benefits of that, probably because of a political lack of cooperation. And I don't know where exactly that sits, but I just know it's not functioning as well as it could. And I think that's a big challenge for us to push forward. That in Scotland, we could eliminate the welfare cap immediately. 120 million, I think IPPR modelled it at it in 2018. So in principle, we could eliminate it. So public expenditure in Scotland is 30% higher per head than in England. We have enough fiscal headroom to do it in Scotland. It's a lack of political will. And we could also, to the point that was raised by one of your speakers earlier, we could peg it to inflation, create a locking system so it automatically inflates every year, so that we don't see that erosion over time that would push people back into poverty. So we could easily construct the system in Scotland just now, and I think there's been nearly enough challenge, frankly, on that, because we've been, dazzled by the Scottish Child Payment as this kind of panacea when it certainly isn't, and it's destined to get worse every year because the pace isn't keeping up with the rate of child poverty increases. So that's just one metric we're not working hard enough on. And I think we have all the tools necessary in Scotland to do this. And I think we need to build a coalition around that in Scotland first and foremost. But to the point, yeah, we need to take down this government ultimately in the UK level. I don't think there's going to be much change in that respect. But I think we can keep pressing those arguments to build that coalition of voters that will vote for politicians who will be minded to do that. And I think there's some really powerful narratives out there. I'll put one in the chat, which I found really good, which Momentum actually created. And it was contrasting spending money in the community versus giving a tax cut to billionaires. And it was showing the economic benefits of flowing that income through the community. And I thought it was one of the most powerful illustrations or narratives that I've ever seen about that idea of seeding money in communities. But anyway, I've ranted on for long enough. So.
Well, I think a lot in there, Paul, in terms of where this campaign can go and wider discussions around how we change social security, not only in Scotland but across the UK. Wendy, I just want to give you a final opportunity. I'm really conscious of time, we're running out now, but just any final pieces of advice or wisdom on that, building that coalition at Westminster. You mentioned the all-party group on ending the need for food banks, but what are the other opportunities we might want to try and exploit as campaigners?
Well, it's interesting because there definitely is some support on the Conservative backbenches in relation to some of this. So a good example is a few weeks ago when we had the increase to pensions and benefits in line with inflation, where they took the figure from September last year. And we had, the only Conservative backbenchers who spoke in that debate were speaking against what the government were doing. In terms of not taking a figure that was more the reality of what people are experiencing, and that fundamental aspect of, if we are saying benefits or pensions should be an amount that allow people to exist and live, well, if we choose not to increase with inflation, well, therefore then we're admitting that we're not giving people sufficient money. I mean, the thing for me is you Google the benefit cap, you go to the government webpage, and in terms of those basics, there's a whole page on how to get help if you're struggling. So there's an acknowledgement by the government that this cap does mean that people experience poverty and cannot manage. I think the other bit is just that whole overall wiring of our economy. Paul touched on it, others touched on it, and again it was Aaron, it struck me, the majority of households not needing to look for work who are experiencing the benefits cap. And there is absolutely no doubt that what we're experiencing is an increased number of people who are economically inactive for a variety of reasons. But we know that we have a record number of job vacancies post-COVID. And again, those are in jobs where potentially there are options to work much, much more flexibly, but those don't seem to be available. And again, I think there is that aspect of people and the complexities. Somebody said in the chat about, Paul said IT is great, and it is, but this digital by default approach from the DWP means for those who that isn't straightforward, or indeed can't get access to Wi-Fi, etc., or a phone. It isn't. So basically, we are not doing everything we can to help people. I think the other final bit for me is just around work coaches. I've been doing quite a lot of FOIs around the training that they get, and I'm getting assured that there's lots, but that is not the anecdotal feedback, both on work coaches and PIP assessments, work capability assessments. I just think that there is not sufficient knowledge and expertise within the DWP to properly help and support people deal with the complex challenges that they have to get them into work. And you know, from a cross-party support perspective, those inefficiencies in the system are potentially a way where you can build cross-party support, because no politician wants to see inefficient systems, particularly in the government backbenches. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Wendy, and thanks, Paul, as well. Really, really insightful contributions from you both, that I think gives us a lot to reflect on as we take forward this campaign around the benefit cap. So thank you both very much for your time this morning, and we'll absolutely keep you in touch with next steps for this campaign. I'm going to ask Susie to join us again, just for a final few thoughts, final couple of words on our next steps as part of the Scrap the Cap campaign. So Susie, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. So I just want to end by encouraging you all to please do get involved in the Scrap the Cap campaign if you're not already. So we have over 60 organisations signed up to the campaign from across the UK already. And again, if you haven't already signed our open letter to the Chancellor ahead of the spring statement, please do sign up. I will send an email at the end with all the details about the letter and how you can sign up and also get involved in the campaign, to everyone who's joined us today and everyone who's signed up who couldn't make it. I wanted to mention as well that ahead of the spring statement, we'll also be launching an e-action tool where people can email their MPs to asking them to support the campaign. So I just want to encourage you all to please share that. I'll share the resources with that, and when you see it coming up on social media, etc., please share it widely. And especially if you're an organisation outside Scotland, please do share this, and also please do sign the letter as well, because we're really keen to keep building that coalition across the UK, and I think that's really important. So we'll send the recording of today's event along with all the information that I mentioned. So please do keep in touch, join the campaign and get involved. And thanks again for joining.
Thanks, Susie, and just to say thank you to everyone to all our speakers this morning, and to everyone joining us. As Susie says, we will keep in touch with you. We aim to build this campaign and to expand the number of partner organisations, partner campaigners that we have right across the UK, and we do think that the benefit cap can be changed, and that's what we're going to keep pressing for. So again, thank you for your time this morning, everyone, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks very much.